If you want to succeed at No Limit Hold'em, you simply must master pre-flop play, because every single hand you are dealt in and you have to make a decision. And if you consistently make poor decisions before the flop, that is going to result in you having a really difficult time winning at poker in the long run. So today, we're going to discuss something very important that you must understand about pre-flop poker. And that is when you should use polarized re-raising ranges compared to when you should use linear 3-betting ranges. And your strategy is not as easy as look at a game theory optimal chart and do what it says, because you always want to make a point to exploit the mistakes your opponents are making. So, what is a polarized range? A polarized 3-betting range is a range where you 3-bet or re-raise, it's the same term, with your very best hands, like aces, kings, queens, and ace-king. You call with your medium strength hands, like decent suited Broadway hands, suited connectors, good offsuit high card hands, and pairs. And then you 3-bet hands that are not quite good enough to call, which will be hands that are on the bottom cusp of your calling hands. And this polarity is essentially going to give you very easy decisions when your opponent then re-raises you when they 4-bet. Because when you have a really good hand, aces, kings, queens, or ace-king, you're very happy putting a lot of money in the pot. And when you don't have one of those hands, you don't have a medium strength hand like king-jack suited or ace-jack offsuit, you instead have much weaker hands. They can very easily fold, like 9-7 suited or ace-9 offsuit, right? So here's an example of a polarized 3-betting strategy. Notice here we are 3-betting the hands in red, calling the hands in green, folding the hands in blue. So this would be, for example, someone raises and then it folds to you on the button, let's say. In this scenario, we are re-raising a pair of 10s and better for value with the idea that we're happy to play a big pot with them. Then we are re-raising ace-jack suited and better and ace-queen offsuit and better, again, straight up for value. We're calling all these hands in green that flop very well, right? Low and middle pairs, suited high cards, a few offsuit Broadway hands, and a few other suited aces, plus some suited connectors. These are all hands that are happy to see the flop. And then we're going to 3-bet these other hands that are on the bottom of our calling range. So notice we're calling ace-10, king-jack, and queen-jack, which will result in us in this scenario re-raising as a bluff with ace-9, king-10, queen-10, and jack-10 offsuit. We're also doing the same thing with our suited range. We have some low king-x suited, ace-6 suited, and then queen-8 suited, jack-8 suited, 10-8 suited, 9-7 suited, 8-6 suited, and 5-4 suited. And a very nice benefit of this strategy is that when you re-raise, your opponent doesn't know if you have a really good hand you're never planning on folding, or a junky hand that you do plan on folding. And on top of that, when you call with a hand like, let's say, king-jack suited or queen-10 suited or ace-jack offsuit, your opponent cannot then re-raise you off of the hand, right? If you instead re-raise that hand, your opponent can then 4-bet you, and then you have to fold out a hand like ace-jack or king-jack suited that flops very well, or at least well enough to the point you don't want to have to fold it. So that is a polarized strategy. A linear strategy is where you 3-bet your best hands, both your very strong value hands, right? And also your decent value hands. And then you call with the weaker hands that are not quite good enough to push equity before the flop, but still want to see the flop and see if they make a good hand. 3-betting linearly essentially allows you to isolate weaker players or players who are just not going to 4-bet you often enough. Because the real big downside of 3-betting with a linear range is that the bottom portion of your strong range really does not want to get 4-bet. But if your opponent will essentially never 4-bet you, that's something you don't have to worry about too much. So here would be an example of a linear pre-flop strategy. Someone raises, we then re-raise all these hands in red, which are just straight up our best hands, right? Pocket 8s and better, ace-10 suited and better, king-jack suited and better, queen-jack suited and better, ace-jack offsuit and better, and king-queen offsuit. And then we call all these other hands in green that are happy to see the flop. And again, the main downside that can happen here is you get 4-bet and then have a really nasty spot with something like ace-jack suited, king-queen suited, king-queen offsuit, ace-jack offsuit, or pocket 9s. These are hands that are usually pretty good if the pot stays manageable, but they're not nearly as good if you get 4-bet. Assuming your opponent will 4-bet with some hands beyond only the absolute best hands. It's not that big of a deal to fold ace-jack suited to a 4-bet if your opponent has literally aces, kings, queens, and ace-king because you're very dominated. But if they'll start using a polarized strategy against you and mix in ace-5 suited and ace-jack offsuit and king-queen offsuit and whatnot, hands that ace-jack or whatever actually does pretty well against, that's when linear strategies become especially bad. So when should you use linear three betting ranges? You want to be three betting linearly, remember, like this, with just the best hands, when your opponent is loose and splashy, meaning they're going to call you a lot, but they will rarely four bet. Consider what happens if your opponent has king nine suited, right? If they raise and you three bet and they call with king nine suited, notice very often they are dominated or way behind, right? That is excellent, which is great. What you do not want to have them to do is then four bet the king nine suited and force you to fold out ace 10 suited, ace jack suited, queen jack suited, king queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit, right? That would be a disaster. So if your opponent's not going to be four bet bluffing very often, this strategy is especially good. And it becomes better and better and better as your opponent is more and more of a calling station. You all tell me, hello, I see you all there, this video is for you, that your opponents don't fold to re-raises before the flop. So great. Three bet them linearly with something like this, and that's going to result in them calling, often from out of position, with a whole lot of hands that you dominate. Next, you want to be three betting linearly when you want to isolate a weak player to try to get the pot heads up. Because imagine you call with, let's say, something like ace 10 suited or ace jack offsuit when someone raises, which you would do with a polarized strategy. That's going to let the players in the blinds call a lot, and now you just have to see the flop multi-way, and quite often if you don't make a good hand, you're going to have a tough time winning the pot. If you instead three bet, that will force the blinds to fold. The initial raiser will not four bet you unless they have the nuts a lot of the time, and that's going to work out very well for you. So you want to make sure you try to isolate the initial raiser, if possible, if they're never going to four bet bluff you. That also has the benefit of not letting the pot go multi-way. Say you know the player on the button likes to call a lot, right? Say the hijack raises, you're in the cutoff. If the player on the button likes to call a lot, meaning you're not going to be in position very often, and you're certainly not going to see the flop heads up, that's a time where you're going to want to three bet linearly far more often than you naturally would, because you don't really want the player in the button in position against you. And finally, you want to be using linear ranges, or at least more linear ranges, as stacks get deeper and deeper, because your opponent's going to call and you just need to make a good hand. And turns out better pre-flop hands make better post-flop hands on average. And you also want to be typically using linear three betting strategies when you are going to be out of position. Because when you're in position, your opponent's going to be a little bit more likely to fold to your three bet because they're out of position and they realize that they are going to under-realize their equity. When they're going to be in position against you, though, they're going to be more inclined to call. So if they're going to be more inclined to call, right, like take a look at point one, if they're more likely to call and rarely four bet, that's when you want to be more linear. So if someone raises and you're in the blinds, either the small blind or the big blind, typically you're going to want to three bet with a linear range and call with all the hands that flop decently well. You can see this if you study the charts at peakgto.com. We have tons of pre-flop charts there for you to check out, and you will see this illustrated very clearly over and over and over and over. In position, you often three bet polarized, assuming your opponent plays well. Out of position, you typically three bet far more linearly. Now, when should you use polarized strategies? Remember, a strategy that looks something like this. You want to be using a polarized three betting strategy when your opponent will usually four bet or fold, meaning they will not call all that often. And that's typically going to happen when you are in position because they want to four bet to essentially make the stack to pot ratio shorter and take away your positional advantage within reason. Next, you want to three bet polarize if your opponent will fold too often to your three bet. Consider what happens in this scenario. Say your opponent raises and then they fold just far too often to re-raises. Well, it doesn't really do you a whole lot of good to take a hand like king jack suited or ace 10 suited or pocket eights and re-raise it, because when your opponent folds, they're folding out hands that were probably in rough shape anyway. If instead, though, you three bet 8-6 suited, 9-7 suited, 7-5 suited, 10-7 suited, well, whatever they're folding is probably better than you, right? So by adding more and more and more of these suited junky hands or offsuit high cards that are not quite good enough to call, that's going to result in your opponent folding out hands that have lots of equity, and you're essentially taking a hand that you would not have otherwise been able to profitably play, and now you're making it profitable because your opponent is folding too often. And just to be clear, if you do re-raise a hand like ace jack and they fold, it's okay. It's not like the end of the world, but that's also a hand where you don't mind calling in position and seeing a flop, right? Next, you want, if you typically want to be three betting polarized when you do call, you have a hand that flops very well, meaning you don't mind if it goes all that multi-way. Take a look at this calling range, right? This calling range in green does very well multi-way, right? We're going to make decent top pairs with the offsuit hands, and all these suited hands have great potential as well as the pairs. So if someone raises and we call with the hands in green, we don't really care if the blinds come along because our range is usually quite decent. And as the players in the blinds play worse and worse, meaning they're going to just generally make mistakes post-flop, you don't mind keeping them in the pot because they're going to be out of position, they're going to unrealize their equity, they're going to make mistakes, and starting off with a good condensed range in the middle, right? Essentially, these hands in green are condensed, meaning they're between the best and the worst hands you're playing. That is going to be a good strategy for the most part. Also, you're going to want to use polarized strategies when you are shallower stacked because quite often your opponents will be more inclined to 4-bet or fold, meaning you either want to have a really good hand they can easily call or a trash that doesn't care if it folds, or when you are in position against good players. That's usually going to be a very good strategy. Let's go through a few more examples of what reasonable ranges could look like. Here is a tight polarized range against a good player. This would be if someone raises from early position and you are in earlier middle position yourself. Notice we are re-raising pretty tightly. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king. Some hands that are not quite good enough to call, including ace-jack offsuit and king-queen offsuit as bluffs. And then we're calling good suited Broadway type hands, middle pairs, ace-queen offsuit, and that's about it. Because we have to worry about the players yet to act, waking up with a hand and then 3-betting us, right? And we also don't get to 3-bet bluff that often because the initial raiser, when they raise, they should have a very good range in general because they raise from early position. Therefore, you just don't get to mess around. So don't mess around. You may say, should I call wider? Maybe, it depends on your scenario. This is a hypothetical range and a reasonable example of what you should do if a tight player raises from early position. They're going to play well, and you're also in early position. You can't splash around too much because, well, you're just going to be in rough shape against the initial raiser. You're going to see the flop multi-way, which is often not great against a strong range, and that is what you need to do in this spot. Here is a far looser range. This is now when a good player raises, but you are now also in late position. So perhaps the cutoff raises, and now you are on the button. In this spot, you can 3-bet wider for value now, 10s and better, ace-jack suited and better, and ace-queen offsuit and better. A smattering of hands that are not quite good enough to call, like ace-9 offsuit, queen-jack off, or jack-10 offsuit, queen-8 suited, king-6 suited, 9-7 suited, 5-4 suited, and then we're calling all the hands in the middle. This is a similar range to this. Notice the rough shape of the range is similar in that you're re-raising the best hands and the hands not quite good enough to call, but essentially you can re-raise slightly wider for value, and because you're re-raising a wider range for value, you get to re-raise more hands as a bluff. Here is an example of a tight linear range against a weak player, a player who's only raising good hands to begin with, right? Someone who's not messing around too much. Against a player like that, you're only going to want to re-raise your absolute best hands. Jacks and better, ace-jack suited and better, and ace-queen offsuit and better. You can't re-raise stuff like ace-9 suited, king-queen suited, pocket sevens, etc., because their range should be strong to begin with. Now, this range does presume your opponent will not 4-bet bluff you. If they 4-bet, you need to know close to definitively, they have aces, kings, queens, and ace-king. And in that scenario, you can 3-bet these hands like ace-queen offsuit and ace-jack suited, and then just fold if they 4-bet. It's okay. You're very dominated. But this is a spot where when you re-raise with ace-queen, ace-jack suited, etc., they're going to call with stuff like ace-10 suited, king-queen suited, etc., and you're going to get a lot of money in very ahead before the flop. Notice you also don't get to call all that often against a strong range to begin with, although your calling range may be a little bit wider. If your opponent instead raises a much wider range, and they will just generally not play well, often by, say, calling pre-flop, check folding after the flop, etc., you would much prefer to 3-bet much wider. So now imagine let's call them a loose player. Not necessarily a weak player, but a player who's loose and kind of passive and weak post-flop. Against someone like that, you can 3-bet far wider. Notice now we're 3-betting pocket eights and better, any two suited cards 9 or higher, ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, and king-queen offsuit, and ace-8 suited, ace-5 suited, and ace-4 suited, while we're calling the hands that flop decently well, right? This would be a reasonable spot to play a wide linear 3-betting range because you want to isolate the player who's going to give up too much post-flop, and that's going to result in you playing heads up in position against that weak-ish calling range, and that's going to go really well for you. So that is it. That is when. Do we add a subtitle? Sure. Do you have any questions? If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section down below. I'm going to do everything I can within reason to come in and answer any questions you have pertaining to linear versus three betting strategies. While you're down there, do me a favor, click the like button, click the subscribe button, click the notification bell. Good luck in your games. Have fun. I hope you learned something today. Share this video with your friends. And I hope you now know when you should use linear versus three betting strategies before the flop. Thanks for watching.